So you're thinking about moving to Portland, Oregon? Well, maybe you want to reconsider. In this video, we're going to talk about 9 of the worst things about living in Portland, Oregon, and all that starts now. Hey, what's up everybody? This is Paul and Seth with the Home Team Brokers coming to you from Portland, Oregon. If this is your first time to the channel living in Oregon, make sure to hit the subscribe button and tap the little bell to get notified every time we drop a new video. People reach out to us all the time who are relocating to the Portland area, and we love to help. So if that's you, give us a call, send us a text, shoot us an email, or click the link below in the description of the video and schedule a Zoom call with us. Either way, we would love to help with your move to Portland.
Where are we gonna start?
Something you've probably heard us talk about, you hear a lot about in doing your research about moving to Portland, is the weather. And you know, a lot of people do move here for the weather to some degree if they're moving from, you know, a really extreme climate, maybe up north, a ton of snow and ice throughout the year, or a really hot climate. You know, the weather here is pretty mild, but it is really gloomy. And I think that's by far the worst part about it.
Yeah.
That's what people hate the most about it. I think, you know, we're the second gloomiest city in the country, you know, second only to Seattle, as far as the amount of gray days with like a majority overcast clouds. And I think the number is 212 days or 220 days throughout the year with overcast. The quantity of rain, you know, that we get in terms of precipitation really isn't, you know, that high. It's more like average for the country, but the amount of days that we get with just rain trickling down, I think, you know, we're in the top 5, maybe number 4 in the country as far as, you know, the amount of rainy days total. So yeah, I mean, you can get people trying to sugarcoat it, but you know, those days get strung together and it's not a lot of fun.
Well, and we do, that definitely is the one thing about the weather, is the gloominess, because we do get people reaching out to us pretty often that are moving here for the weather, oftentimes coming from California or Arizona too, probably one of the more common ones. But the gloominess is tough to deal with. Aside from the gloominess, you know, kind of the rain, really wouldn't be that bad. But yeah, definitely agree on the gloominess. Next on the list, I would say the housing. It's obviously bad all across the country, but it's particularly bad here. We do have lower inventory here, not just for homes that are for sale, but also rentals are really tough as well right now. I think a lot of people don't maybe necessarily realize that, maybe that they're moving here for a job and like, okay, I gotta move to Portland and let's figure out what this market looks like. And they say, oh, the inventory is really low, home prices are maybe higher than I expected, I'm probably gonna have to rent. But then they go and look for a rental and they're like, oh, the rental market's really tough too. I mean, it's just as hard to find a rental as it is to win an offer and buy a house right now. So I think the housing market is definitely one of the tougher things for people moving to Portland here.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it's really been the case the last couple of years since COVID. There's kind of been this housing boom. Home prices have gone up like crazy, and now interest rates are starting to rise a little bit. So we are seeing a little bit of a shift in the market, but affordability has taken an even bigger hit, you know, with increased home values, now with increased rates. So, you know, it's still really competitive, in particular for properties that, you know, are more or less turnkey, don't need a lot of work, or in a nice area, good neighborhood, and things like that. But, you know, when you look at, you know, the competitiveness, you know, as far as being a seller's market, you know, again, a property that is, you know, again, in a good area, turnkey, it's probably going to have multiple offers. You know, you're probably looking at the expectation being that it's going to sell above list price, but you might be able to come in and not make as many concessions, you know, and potentially not offer, you know, a crazy overlist offer price necessarily, but the inventory is still low. And that's really what's, I think, getting most people is, you know, yeah, despite the affordability and interest rates being up and all those other factors, you know, that will kind of fluctuate over time. You know, there's such a low inventory of housing. You know, housing inventory is so low. You know, the outlook, you know, doesn't really look like it's going to turn around, you know, in the next year or two. Like maybe, you know, rates could go down next year, you know, or in the next few months. But there's such a significant shortage of housing inventory. It's going to take several years, maybe a decade, to catch up to demand.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is being in a migratory state. More people moving here than moving away. We've got people moving here from California and Arizona. People are moving away to places like Idaho and Texas, but again, there is more people moving here than moving out of the state. So that's definitely not going to help inventory and competition. So it's probably going to be a pretty tough housing market, not just around Portland, but really most of the entire state for probably a while.
Yeah, so, when you look at some of the kind of the worst things about living here, ultimately getting into and finding the right property is an enormous challenge, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. Ultimately, that's why you have to reach out to Seth and I, because we're going to be able to talk about the right strategies, where you should be looking, as far as what fits your budget and your wants and your needs, and how we can win an offer and, hopefully eliminate some of those pain points and, take some of that stress out and make it a little bit of a smoother process, once you start looking and ultimately are ready to buy.
How about next on our list? How about food? We've got a lot of really great food here, but a lot of that food is really kind of contained like to the inner city and Portland Metro, the Tri-County area, Clackamas and Washington County. We don't have as many good restaurants or food options once you kind of get out into Clackamas or Washington County. So that is kind of one thing, and that's probably the case, I'm sure, with a lot of major cities. And we have seen some of the better restaurants or the more popular restaurants in Portland proper, open up new locations, kind of more out in the suburbs, like in Clackamas and Washington County. But definitely a lot of the vast majority of the good food you have to go to Portland to. Not nearly as much good food out in the suburbs.
Portland is one of the best culinary cities in the country, and that's that's not a fact you can argue. I mean, that's reported. That's an objective truth. And when you look at accessibility to all that great food, like Seth's saying, so much of that, 80-90% of that is concentrated, right in close to downtown Portland. A lot downtown and northwest Portland, and kind of close in southeast and northeast Portland. Historically, the suburbs kind of have, the reputation of, having like a lot of the restaurant chains, your Applebee's and your,
Right.
TGI Fridays and, Outback Steakhouses and things like that. And I think, kind of by and large, that's still really true. Although, like Seth said, there are a lot of great restaurants moving out, to food carts and, just different locations, in particular, in areas like Beaverton, Lake Oswego, and probably some others that you could speak to over in Clackamas County.
Part of the reason why that is, we've heard from some business owners is, it's been a struggle for restaurant owners in Portland and kind of downtown Portland and Portland proper, with crime and homelessness and unrest and all the protesting. It's been a struggle for them to keep the doors open, to keep customers coming in there. So that's one reason we've heard some of these restaurant owners start up new locations out in the suburbs. But we can definitely use more good restaurants, more variety, I should say. There's good restaurants, just not a ton of variety, so you kind of find yourself going to the same place over and over again, or maybe you have to go to like a neighboring town, to try something new. So that's kind of one thing about that will probably get better, but kind of one downside is not a ton of food selection unless you're like right in downtown Portland or near downtown Portland.
So next thing on the list, diversity, which I think historically Portland has two simultaneous reputations: that we're a very diverse and accepting place, but also that Portland isn't diverse at all.
Yeah.
So, you could look at this from two different angles depending on what's most important to you. But statistically, Portland is the fourth least racially diverse city in the country. And I think, some people see that and, hear that that's kind of, the reputation of Portland, that, Portland is very homogenous and it's not a very diverse place. But, in fact, and, like we've talked about in different videos, Portland is very culturally diverse and, very accepting, to all people. So, this is one that, again, you could look at from a lot of different angles. And, you know, Portland is evolving and changing a lot. Like Seth said, Oregon in general and Portland, you know, these are migratory areas. People are flocking here, you know, that weren't necessarily born and raised here. And, you know, people that all, you know, look all kinds of different ways. So
yeah, and I'd say, you know, there's that funny paradox of like people saying like, hey, we're not very diverse, so you shouldn't come here. Well, it's like, well, if that's the message, then we're probably not ever gonna be diverse, right? If we're telling people that don't look like everybody else here not to come here because we're not diverse, then that's how things are gonna stay. So I would say, like Paul said, people here are very accepting. And if you're somebody that's worried about that, you don't feel like you look like everybody here, then, you know, don't listen to that messaging of we're not diverse, don't come here. Come here, find out how accepting people are, and you know, and change that a little bit. You know, be one of the people that makes, you know, that change and increases the diversity here. So I think that's you hear that in kind of like a lot of the pros and cons. People will say that's a big con, that it's not diverse here, but you know, like Paul said, we are very accepting here, and I think Portland is very welcoming of diversity. So if you're somebody that's maybe kind of thinking like on the fence, like, will I fit in there? Will I like it there? Will I find friends there? You definitely will. You'll find your tribe. You'll find your group of friends here for sure.
absolutely. All right, so the next thing on our list, one of the worst things about being in Portland is that there's weed everywhere. You can't get away from it. No, not really. But there's a couple of different ways that you could look at this. There is weed everywhere to some extent. It's not going to be in your face. You're not going to see people smoking weed in public everywhere you go. But in most areas in the city and in a lot of the suburbs, I mean, there's a weed store like every couple of blocks. So
yeah. So I think there's kind of like this negative connotation, you know, that Portland's like a stoner town or Oregon's like a stoner state or something, you know, for that reason. And you know, it's all personal preference. Like Paul said, there's some places where there's pot shops on every block, and then it's actually city by city. So some cities allow it, some don't. So you can find some places that don't have any marijuana and you won't really ever see it anywhere. So if you want to be by it, it's going to be real easy to do, and if you want to stay away from it, you can stay away from it too. But there is that kind of that negative connotation that I think it's associated with Oregon, because we were one of the first ones to legalize it.
yeah, so obviously this is you know, really down to personal preference, like Seth said. And so whether or not it's an issue or something that you care about or think about, or maybe it's something that's bringing you to the area, you know, that's the case with a lot of people that we talk to. So
Yeah,
you know, again, it really depends. It's pretty case by case. But weed is very accessible, you know, to some degree. It is part of the culture. You do see it in a lot of places, billboards, brick and mortar stores. But you know, the reputation of Portland being like this stoner haven and everybody smokes weed all the time, it's just not true.
Yeah. All right, how about dating? I would say dating is not great in Portland, and maybe because of the gloominess maybe leads to higher depression. You know, people aren't getting out and about as much. It's definitely easier to go meet people when you can get out and about a little bit more, especially get outside. You know, so I kind of remember thinking that growing up, that it's like the dating is not that great. It's like, what do you do to go meet people other than going to a nightclub, you know, when you're like 21 or something like that. And I think there's been studies, Portland's been rated pretty low for the dating scene. Now I haven't looked at that anytime recently, you know, that's just kind of thinking off the top of my head, you know, 5, 10, 20 years ago when it was more top of mind for me. And technologies maybe changed that, you know, with all the different apps like Tinder that allows you just to meet people online. Maybe it doesn't matter as much anymore, but I think Portland is definitely not one of the better dating cities.
Yeah, like Seth said, I mean, Portland's always on, you know, kind of these lists of, you know, one of the worst places, you know, for dating, like, you know, for young professionals or, you know, whatever the category. And, you know, I think overall, you know, you could look at this in a couple of different ways. I mean, you know, Portland is, you know, kind of this bright, vibrant city with a lot of events and things going on, but that's like, you know, 4 months out of the year.
Yeah.
So, you know, in a lot of ways, like during the summer, I think people are very social. People like to get out and do things. You know, people like to go out to bars and, you know, go to all the events downtown and things like that. But, you know, I think on the other hand, you know, the culture here does tend to be pretty reclusive. You know, people do like to stay inside, although, you know, people do like the outdoor activities and things like that. There's a lot of people that engage in those things, but just kind of in your day-to-day, you know, I think people do tend to be a little more reclusive here than in other places. And, you know, there's not really like these districts in Portland where you have, you know, a ton of young professionals that all work, you know, in this like, you know, 20 block area of the city, and they're all, you know, going out to happy hours, you know, every day after work and things like that, like you might have in like San Francisco, for example.
Yeah, that's a good point. We do have a lot of young people here though, so there is that kind of redeeming quality, that at least there will be a big pool. It's just kind of a matter of meeting those people. All right, last thing on our list is traffic. Now, I know people from like LA, maybe a few other places like in Texas, Houston or something like that are gonna say, hey, you haven't seen anything. And I do remember last time that we were in LA, I remember driving to the airport.
Oh my gosh.
I think we were bumper to bumper for like an hour.
Oh, it took at least an hour to go, I don't know, 5 miles.
Yeah, I wasn't feeling so hot either. And our Uber driver wanted to talk to us the whole time about his little side jobs and being...
Oh, he's an actor.
Okay. I shouldn't call it side jobs, but you know, actor, part-time actor, Uber driver.
Yeah.
And dime a dozen in LA. But
yeah.
Traffic here is really bad, and we have like a lot of like 3-lane and even like 2-lane highways. There's a lot of people here, and people here aren't really, I don't think, they're not really conditioned to driving quickly either, too. So there's not the same type of drivers. Drivers are much more aggressive in LA and California, and people are used to passing and getting over and stuff like that. And Oregon, people are just competitive. They just like to drive next to each other, you know, on the buddy system. And it feels like they're always working on the roads here too. And so that makes traffic even worse, you know, and it's all the projects they've done. It'll take like a year to, you know, like work on a mile of roads. So it just always feels like there's always some kind of construction, and there's always congestion. The traffic is, even since we've had COVID and since we've had work from home, it's still pretty bad here. It's definitely, I'm sure again, it's not like LA, but it's got to be worse than most other big cities, it feels like.
Yeah, and I mean, Portland's growing very quickly, so you know the infrastructure to support it, you know, is that's definitely an issue. You know, and they are expanding highways and adding lanes and, you know, doing some of those things to mitigate, you know, some of the traffic issues. But Portland is pretty sprawled out for being more or less kind of a mid-sized city. It is a relatively large metro area, and you know, some people might want to, you know, live in kind of a hip neighborhood in Southeast Portland, but they work out at Nike or Intel, you know, so you're looking at 10 to 12 miles, but, you know, on freeways that are, you know, very, very backed up during rush hour, you know, and what could be a 20-minute drive otherwise, you know, ends up being over an hour for that commute. Or similarly, I mean, you know, you could be looking at, you know, some really nice suburban areas that are a little further away from the city, but you work downtown or something like that, you know, you're kind of looking at the same issue. So it seems like people do end up quite a bit living in areas where they don't necessarily work. Some people want to be right there, you know, right by where they work. A lot of people are working remote too, obviously, so this doesn't necessarily apply as much. But, you know, even, you know, not, you know, even looking at, you know, not just your, something falling out of the tree over there. You know, even looking beyond your work commute, I mean, you know, getting to other towns throughout the Portland metro area, or just getting downtown for events, going out to dinner, things like that, especially during rush hour. I mean, you probably need to budget about an hour.
Yeah, for sure. So how about crime? I would say, you know, crime definitely wasn't one that was probably on the list for people that are moving here or people that live here, but definitely in the last few years, especially since the pandemic, crime has really shot up. And I know that's probably true of a lot of cities, but I think it's probably particularly true for Portland. For whatever reason, Portland hasn't done very well since the pandemic. Specifically, you know, one of the things that you see in the news the most is the gun violence, gun crime. Shootings are up, and homicides are up too. You know, so obviously some of the worst crimes that people want to try and avoid. Not in every part of Portland. It's really certain pockets of Portland. So it's not like it's rampant everywhere, but it's definitely gone up quite a bit in the last couple of years.
Yeah, so, you know, crime overall is something that we can't necessarily talk too much about as real estate professionals, because we can't steer people, you know, to or from different neighborhoods. But, you know, there's a lot of public data out there on different websites like niche.com, for example. So a simple Google search will give you a pretty good idea of, you know, what areas see a higher concentration of both property crime and violent crime. In particular, I mean, if you're looking at the Portland metro area, a vast majority of the crime that you see is going to be closer into the city and in Multnomah County, where Portland proper is. You know, there's crime everywhere, so, you know, to some degree, you know, it kind of comes down to, you know, your safety, what you feel safe with, your threshold in terms of what you're able to tolerate and what kind of environment you want to live in. But, you know, especially as you start going through, you know, some research, looking at areas that really stand out as low crime or areas that you might want to avoid, those are conversations that we can have as we begin your home search. But it's not easy to ignore, you know, a lot of, you know, the crime being reported in the media. We hear it about it a lot. Like Seth said, you know, homicides and gun violence, you know, across the board is up higher, you know, year over year the last couple of years. Property crime as well. I mean, you know, one of the biggest things you hear about is like cars getting broken into, for some reason catalytic converters being stolen from cars. I don't know exactly why.
They're worth a lot of money. They have some minerals or some sort of metals in them that they can sell for quite a bit of money.
Sure.
So I think that's the big reason why.
Yeah.
I don't know why we haven't fixed that problem yet. I heard there was going to be legislation to that was going to hinder people from transacting catalytic converters or used ones, but haven't heard much about that lately.
I don't think Portland's the most dangerous city in the country by any stretch.
No.
You know, but it is a big city. This is a major metro area. You know, there's definitely crime here. And it seems to be, you know, something that more and more is, you know, it's something that we get asked about and something that's on people's minds. So obviously safety is important. And obviously we want to help put you, you know, in an area, help you move into an area where you feel most comfortable. So, you know, a lot of times when we're working with clients, you know, crime is something that is high on that list. So definitely something to consider. And, you know, in particular, you know, when you look at Portland, definitely something where, you know, we can look at what's, you know, what area is going to be kind of the best fit for you.
Yeah, our local newspaper, the Oregonian, probably one of the easier kind of graphs to look at. They did a shooting map. You can probably just Google search Oregonian shooting map, and you've got little pinpoint spots on a map of Portland where shootings were reported, and you can sort of correlate that to a lot of other crime. So that map, I think, probably gives you most of the information that you want to see if you're trying to avoid certain places.
All right, so next on the list, a little bit hand in hand with crime is homelessness. And again, major city, this is something that in particular cities up and down the West Coast are really struggling with, and Portland is certainly no exception. And so whether you want to look at this as a humanitarian crisis, or, you know, I don't think anybody likes to see tents up and down the sidewalks, you know, be it they're unsightly, or again, it's, you know, from more of a humanitarian perspective. Either way, it's pretty clear that the city doesn't know what to do about the homeless issue. And actually, I saw a surprising stat. The number seemed a little bit low. The federal government requires major cities and required Portland to do it was called a point in time study. And so it was one night, I think back in March of 2022, Portland had to, actually the entire metro area had to report on the amount of homeless people on that given night reported. And in Multnomah County, there was about 5,200. In Washington County, there was about 800. And in Clackamas County, there was about 600. So, you know, that tells you a lot as far as geographically where some of the biggest issues are. Again, downtown Portland is in Multnomah County, Clackamas County, and Washington County are a little more suburban and even rural, you know, to some degree as far as kind of the makeup of those areas. So, you know, this is definitely a problem, and it's something that's on a lot of people's mind.
Yeah, some places allow camping, some places allow urban camping, you know, people putting up tents on the sidewalks, and some don't. So, you know, that's going to vary from place to place. Again, we can kind of help you figure out where those places are. And, you know, it's really not benefiting anybody. It's not benefiting the people that are camping or the businesses, or, you know, the people that are patronizing those businesses, you know, that are being camped in front of, to allow those people to kind of, you know, camp out and just rot out on the sidewalk. So, you know, the city obviously isn't doing a very good job. I know another city that is doing a pretty good job is Miami. They have, I believe, 512 homeless people. They know every single one of them by name because they do a good job of tracking them and actually trying to help these people. So Portland hasn't quite figured it out. Their only kind of solution right now is to make people leave. You know, they're more just shuffling them around. You know, the people leave, they come back. You know, there's no real long-term solution for these people. So that's one thing the city definitely hasn't figured out. I'm an optimist. I have faith that they will figure it out at some point here in the near future. Again, it's just not a good situation for anybody to have people camping out and sleeping on the streets all over the place. You know, and it does kind of, like Paul said, kind of go hand in hand with that first one, because it does breed more crime. You know, you get people built up, because we get these like big camps, you know, where you'll have like 20 people, you know, in a camp, and 30 people all camped out in this like camping community. And then you hear from the other, you know, the homeless people, and, you know, they feel more compelled to stay in one of those areas. And, you know, they're usually at a higher risk, you know, themselves for experiencing a crime, you know, whether it's like a rape or an assault or something like that. So really not doing anybody any good to kind of let all these people kind of rot out in the streets and camp. So that's one thing that really didn't exist that much, you know, up until a couple years ago. You would see the occasional people like kind of, you know, sleeping bags. You wouldn't see the tents. So it's definitely gotten a lot worse in the last few years, but I think we'll get back to where we were a couple years ago, where you just don't see all of the homelessness that you do now.
Yeah, it's obviously really sad to see, you know, for a number of reasons. And, you know, it seems like the most proactive thing that the city is doing is, like, you know, what Seth was saying is, you know, there's a lot of these encampments across areas of the city, and, you know, just kind of, you know, at any given point in time, the city will clear out certain, you know, sections, certain encampments, and then, you know, all the people will leave that area, they'll just go to another. And the cycle will continue, and then the area that was vacated over time will kind of slowly start to populate again. So it's just kind of shuffling the deck. I did see a piece of legislation where in the city of Portland, public camping was banned in quote-unquote high traffic areas, so areas near busy intersections and things like that. And you know, believe it or not, that was actually because there was a lot of pedestrian deaths, many of whom were homeless people, because they were, you know, taking up space in these high traffic areas and jumping out in front of cars and things like that, or maybe not jumping, but walking out into the street. And so, you know, obviously they're people too, and, you know, we want to protect everybody's safety, but, you know, that particular piece of legislation didn't do anything to help homelessness, you know, and kind of some of the root issues. So, you know, again, that's the most proactive thing that I've seen, you know, in years, and obviously that's not even scratching the surface. So
yeah, I did hear about that. People getting hit by cars, homeless people getting hit by cars. Yeah, and it was my understanding that some of them were just in their tents, just, you know, sleeping. Yeah. And, you know, somebody's on their phone, they're not paying attention, they swerve off the road a little bit, all of a sudden, you know, you run into a tent with somebody in it. So yeah, not a good situation. And it's not everywhere, you know, so it's not a massive problem like maybe in a SoCal, but it's definitely become a problem the last few years, and the city hasn't quite figured it out yet.
Yeah, it's sad stuff.
I think that's a pretty good list. You know, and obviously not designed to scare anybody off.
Well, it's a bad list.
Right, that's a bad list. It's a pretty good bad list. Not designed to scare anybody off, obviously, but those are kind of you know, candid opinions from two people that have lived here our entire lives. I feel like when I first started driving, which was over 20 years ago, as weird as that is to say, like, just traffic wasn't a thing. You just didn't really encounter traffic. Like, maybe rarely if you're going someplace like a Blazer game or like a concert where there's a bunch of people or something like that, but traffic on the day-to-day just wasn't a thing, whereas now it's just like part of life for some people, especially in some areas. Now, there probably are some areas where there's not much traffic, but there's definitely some areas where it's like you're gonna hit traffic every single time without fail. It doesn't even matter what time of day it is.
But
so,
you know, that's another reason why, you know, working with agents like us, we're going to be able to talk about what those commutes look like, you know, whether it is driving to or from work or other areas that you see yourself spending time in. You know, we can talk about what the commutes look like, and, you know, if that's a big deal for you, we can factor that into your home search as well.
Yeah, so if you are thinking about moving here, if you want to talk, give us a call, send us a text, shoot us an email, or click the link below if you want to schedule a Zoom, typically best for people coming from out of town. And if this video helped you, give us a thumbs up. It lets us know we're doing a good job. Feel free to comment too. We reply to the comments, and make sure and subscribe so you see more videos like this.
Thanks for watching.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.